I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter did not save me a seat at my own granddaughter's birthday party. It was a Saturday in late March, one of those Georgia afternoons that can't quite decide between winter and spring, where the air smells like pine and cut grass and something that hasn't bloomed yet. Lily was turning 8. I had driven 40 minutes from Savannah to their house in Pooler, the same house I had helped them buy, not in a metaphorical way, not in the way people say helped, when they mean they gave advice and brought a casserole. I wrote a check for $31,000 so they could make the down payment when the bank said they were 12% short. There were pink balloons tied to the mailbox, a banner across the porch that said "Happy Birthday, Lily" in glitter letters. Cars lined both sides of the street, which I had not expected, and I had to park half a block away and walk in the drizzle with a wrapped box under my arm that contained the art set. Lily had asked for specifically the good kind, the kind with real watercolor brushes and a wooden case, not the plastic set from the drugstore. My son-in-law answered the door. His name is Craig. He is the kind of man who fills a room with the idea of himself before he fills it with anything useful. He smiled at me the way people smile at someone they were not expecting quite yet, a fraction too wide, a half-second too slow. "Come on in," he said. "Party's out back." He did not take the gift. He had already turned toward the kitchen. The backyard had been decorated within an inch of its life. String lights, rented tables with paper tablecloths, a balloon arch in pink and gold that probably cost more than my car payment. My daughter Vonnie stood near the dessert table with a glass of something sparkling, talking to a group of women I did not recognize, laughing in the particular way she laughed when she wanted people to think she was effortless. She had her father's laugh. Franklin had been gone 6 years and I still heard him sometimes in places I did not expect. She saw me and waved, a single wave, the kind you give a neighbor whose name you half remember, and then she turned back to her conversation. Lily found me first. She came running from the direction of the bounce house with pink frosting already on her chin and her hair coming loose from its braids, and she threw herself at me with the full uncalculated force of a child who has not yet learned to manage how much she feels. "Grandma," she said into my shoulder. "You came." "Of course I came," I said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" She pulled back and looked at me with that particular expression she had, serious and bright at the same time, like she was always in the middle of working something out. "Mom said you might be tired," she said. I looked at my daughter across the yard. She was still laughing. "I'm not tired," I told Lily. "Show me where the birthday girl sits." There was no seat for me at the family table. I could see that from where I stood. The round table nearest the dessert station held Craig's parents, his brother and sister-in-law, and 2 couples I'd never met. Vonnie's chair was between Craig and a woman, with a loud laugh, who kept touching Craig's arm when she made a point. There was a folding chair someone had added at the far end of the table, wedged between the table leg and the fence. A white plastic chair with a slight wobble, set slightly apart the way you set something when you remembered it at the last minute. I sat in it without saying anything. The table was too wide for easy conversation and too narrow for me to pull in comfortably. Someone passed a basket of rolls. It reached Craig's mother before it reached me, and when it arrived in my direction, it was empty. No one noticed. I ate a hot dog from the kids' table because Lily brought me one herself, very proud of the mustard ratio she had achieved. The cake was cut and Vonnie served everyone at the main table before she circled back to where I was sitting. My piece arrived on a paper plate that had gotten damp from condensation and the frosting had slid slightly to one side. Happy birthday to my granddaughter, I thought. Happy birthday indeed. Craig gave a little speech about what a wonderful mother Vonnie was. He said, "We've built something really special here, all of us together," and he gestured broadly at the yard and the lights and the people, and I noticed he did not look in my direction when he said it, even though the down payment that bought this yard and these lights was still sitting in their mortgage history with my name on the transfer. On the drive home, I kept the radio off. The Georgia interstate was moving fine, but I drove deliberately, both hands on the wheel the way Leroy had always told me to. Leroy had been a careful man. He taught me that carefulness was a form of respect, for the road, for the people in other cars, for yourself. I had been driving alone for 6 years, and I still heard his voice sometimes on wet roads. By the time I pulled into my driveway in Savannah, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the live oaks were moving slow in the wind off the water. I sat in the car for a moment before going in. My house is a craftsman bungalow on a street with other craftsman bungalows, the kind of neighborhood that went from working class to sought after between the time we moved in and the time Leroy died. We paid $90,000 for it in 1991. A house 3 doors down sold for $420,000 last spring. I knew this because Craig had mentioned it in passing at Christmas, with the tone of someone mentioning it for the second or third time in a way that was not really passing at all. I went inside and set my purse on the kitchen table and stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I went to my home office. It was a small room off the back hallway where I used to grade papers when I was still teaching. I taught 6th grade for 29 years in Chatham County. Before that, I taught in a school in Brunswick that didn't have enough textbooks to go around, and we made do, which is what you do when you love the work more than the conditions. The desk in my office was the same one Leroy had built for me the year I finished my master's degree, solid pine, with a drawer that sometimes stuck in the humidity. In the bottom drawer was the folder I had been keeping for the past 4 years. Not because I expected anything, because I had been a teacher long enough to understand that documentation is not pessimism. It is clarity. You write things down so that someday, if someone tries to rewrite the story, you have the original draft. I opened the folder and read through it the way I had not let myself do in a while. $31,000 for the down payment on the Pooler house, transferred in the spring of 2021. 2 years of private school tuition for Lily before Vonnie decided the public school was fine after all, which it had always been fine, but I had not said that at the time because Vonnie was upset and I did not want to add to it. 14 months of help with their car payments when Craig's landscaping business went through a rough stretch that he attributed to supply chain issues, and that I suspected had more to do with the way he managed the business, but I had not said that either. Vonnie's medical bills from the year she had the surgery, because Craig's insurance had a deductible that was, in his words, absolutely brutal, and I had written that check without being asked twice, because she was my daughter and she was scared. I had given willingly, I want to be clear about that. Nobody twisted my arm. Nobody made threats. They asked, or sometimes they didn't need to ask because I could see what they needed, and I gave, because that is what I had always done, because I had been raised to believe that you took care of your people. But somewhere between the first check and the birthday party with the wobbling chair and the soggy cake plate, the giving had stopped being something I chose and had become something they expected. And expectation, once it settles into a person, is very hard to move without something breaking. Near the back of the folder was an envelope I had received 3 weeks earlier and had not opened until the night I got home from the party. It was addressed to me. The return address was a law firm in Atlanta I did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a form letter with my name filled in at the top, and several references to estate planning and asset transition, and a phrase I had to read twice before I understood it. Proactive family-initiated financial management for aging homeowners. My son-in-law had contacted an estate attorney to explore his options for getting ahead of what he called, in the attached intake form that had been mistakenly included in my envelope, the property situation. The property situation was my house. I set the paper on the desk and looked at the garden through the dark window. Leroy's roses were still out there, bare in the March cold, dormant, but not gone. He had planted them the spring Lily was born because he believed in that kind of ceremony. I was not angry. I have thought about this since, and I want to be precise. I was not angry the way people mean when they say angry, which usually means hot and immediate. What I felt was colder than that and more useful. It was the feeling of a decision that had been slow in coming and had finally arrived, like a fog lifting, not with warmth, but with the flat, functional light of clarity. I closed the folder. I did not sleep easily that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house, the creak of the porch boards in the wind, the tick of the radiator, the sounds house makes when it belongs to you and is trying to remind you of that. Around 4 in the morning, I got up, put on coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the folder and a legal pad. I had been a teacher. I knew how to think a problem through from the beginning. By 6 in the morning, I knew what I was going to do. I drove downtown when the bank opened at 9. The branch manager's name was Sandra, and she was a composed, careful woman who had helped me restructure the accounts after Lee Reed died. She did not talk to me the way some people at banks talk to women my age, like they are waiting for confusion to arrive. She poured me water without being asked and sat across from me with her hands folded and listened. I told her I needed to remove my daughter and son-in-law as authorized users from my credit accounts. I told her I needed to change the beneficiary designations on the savings accounts and to put a security alert on the primary checking account. I told her I needed to review every recurring transfer out of my accounts. She went through them one by one. There was a monthly transfer of $400 to an account in Craig's name that I had set up during the landscaping rough stretch and had never cancelled. "When did you want this stopped?" she asked. "Today," I said. She turned her monitor slightly toward me. There was a flag on the screen, a notification from the security system. 2 days earlier, someone had attempted to access my account online using a password that was close to correct but not quite. The system had locked them out after the third attempt. I thought about the notepad in my desk drawer, the one where I had written down my banking passwords 2 years ago when Vonnie had asked me to. "Just in case something happens to you, Mom, and we need to get to things quickly." I had believed that was love asking. I said, "I need all passwords changed and new security questions set up before I leave." Sandra nodded. She turned back to her keyboard and worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who has seen this before and understands that her job in this moment is not to editorialize. It took 45 minutes. When we finished, I thanked her and walked out into a Georgia morning that had finally decided to be warm. I drove from the bank to the office of my attorney. His name is James Whitmore, and he has practiced in Savannah for 35 years, and he is the kind of man who understands that people who sit across from him are usually carrying more than the papers they have brought with them. He stood when I came in and shook my hand and told his assistant to hold his calls. I told him I needed to revise my will. He listened. He did not write anything down while I was talking, which I always respected about him, the willingness to simply listen before moving to action. When I finished, he asked me one question: had I slept on this, or was I deciding from the middle of an emotional event? I told him both, and that after 63 years I had found those two things were not always different from each other. He accepted that. We began. I had 3 primary assets: the house, which Leroy and I had bought for $90,000, and which was now worth somewhere north of $400,000, and which I had never taken a second mortgage on, no matter what the financial pressure had been. The retirement accounts I had built over 29 years of teaching, modest but steady, the kind that don't make headlines but keep a person independent. And a small investment account I had opened in the early 2000s, with the discipline of someone who grew up watching her parents have nothing and decided that would not be her story. I removed my daughter and son-in-law from all of it. Everything above a small personal bequest would go into a trust for Lily, managed independently until she turned 25. James drafted it carefully. Each page he slid across the desk I signed without hesitation, not because I was certain about everything, but because I was certain about this. Then James said something that made me set down the pen. He told me that 4 weeks earlier my son-in-law had called his office. Craig had asked, James said with the particular flatness of a man choosing his words carefully, about the general process for pursuing conservatorship of a parent or in-law who might be experiencing diminished capacity. He said he had not returned the call. I sat with that for a moment. The office was quiet. Outside, a truck moved down the street. Conservatorship, the legal mechanism that allows one person to take control of another person's finances and decisions when the other person is deemed unable to manage them independently. Craig had called my attorney to ask how to do that to me, and then he had shown up at Lily's birthday party and smiled and said, "Come on in, party's out back," and handed me a soggy piece of birthday cake. I said, "Let's finish." We were done by noon. I drove home through the Savannah lunch traffic and let the familiar streets require enough of my attention to quiet everything else for a little while. I did not need thoughts. I needed lunch and my own walls and the particular comfort of a space that was entirely mine. I had barely set my bag down when my phone began. Vonnie first. A text that said, "Craig says something is wrong with the card. Can you call the bank?" Then a call I let go to voicemail. Then another text. "Mom, his business account tried to pull from the joint card for supplies, and it was declined. He has a crew waiting. Please fix this." Then Craig directly. A text that read, "I'm standing in the middle of a supply run and my card isn't working. Whatever happened needs to be corrected today." The phrasing of that, "needs to be corrected today," as if I were the error. I made a sandwich at my kitchen table, poured a glass of sweet tea, and watched a pair of cardinals move through Leroy's roses in the backyard. The mail landed on the highest cane and sat there for a moment in the afternoon light, completely unbothered. By 2:30, Vonnie's car was in my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window. She sat in the car for several minutes before getting out, which was not like her. Vonnie had always moved with the decisiveness of someone who had decided in advance how things were going to go. She got out alone. Craig was not with her. She knocked. I waited a moment and then opened the door. She was wearing the expression she had used since she was a teenager when she wanted her to appear reasonable, but was not feeling it. Chin slightly lifted, eyes working very hard to stay soft. "Mom," she said, "I think there's been a mix-up with the accounts." I said, "Come in if you want to talk." She came in and stood in the middle of my living room the way she always stood in it, with a kind of survey that I had never been able to name until recently. She looked at the furniture and the photographs and the quilt my mother had made that hung over the back of the reading chair. And there was something in her eyes that was not quite warmth and not quite calculation, but was somewhere between the two. She said, "Craig is really embarrassed. He had workers standing around, waiting, and the card just stopped." I said, "I know." She paused, "You know?" I sat down in my reading chair. I said, "I also know about the call to James Whitmore's office." She went very still. I said, "I know about the estate attorney in Atlanta. I know about the attempted account access." Her face did the thing faces do when a prepared script has become suddenly useless. She looked, for just a moment, like the person underneath the strategy, and that person was someone I recognized, someone I had rocked to sleep and driven to school and held in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. I felt the love I had for her clearly and steadily, and I also felt, just as clearly, that love had never required me to hand over my life. She said, "Mum, we were just trying to plan ahead. You're not as young as you used to be, and the house is a significant asset, and we thought," I said, "you thought I wouldn't find out, or you thought I wouldn't mind?" She didn't answer. I said, "You've been planning for what happens to my property before anything has happened to me, without asking me, without a single conversation." She sat down on the couch then, not the way she usually sat, not claiming the cushion, just sitting, elbows on her knees. She looked at the floor. I waited. After a long time, she said quietly, "Craig pushed for most of it." "I want you to know that," I said. "I know Craig pushed, but you let him." She didn't answer that either. What followed was long, and went in circles the way these things do when they have been building for years. She said she had only ever wanted to be practical. She said I had never made things easy by refusing to talk about the future. She said Craig was under a lot of financial pressure, and maybe he had gone about things the wrong way, but his intentions were not bad. I listened. Then I said, "I have spent a significant portion of my retirement helping your household. Down payment, car payments, medical bills, school tuition. I gave all of it without being asked twice because you were my daughter and I loved you. And I believed that someday the giving would become something that went both ways." She looked up. I said what it became instead was an assumption, and underneath the assumption was a plan to take the rest of it before I had a chance to decide for myself. Her eyes were bright. She said, "That is not fair," I said. "The call to my attorney about conservatorship, was that fair?" The room was quiet for a long time, I said. "The accounts are changed. The cards are closed. The will has been revised. What Lily receives is protected. What happens next in your household is something you and Craig will need to work out without my accounts as a safety net." She left without saying much more. Her footsteps down my porch steps were careful, which was somehow harder to hear than if they had been angry. I stood at the window and watched her car pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner. The week that followed was so quiet I could hear my own thoughts again. No texts at odd hours asking me to move money. No calls that opened with casual conversation and moved within 4 minutes to a specific request. My phone sat on the counter and I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat and slept through the night and took my morning walks at whatever pace the morning asked for. On the 4th day, Lily called me from her own phone, the little tablet Vonnie let her use for video calls. She wanted to show me a watercolor she had made with the art set. It was a picture of the roses in my backyard. She had gotten the color almost right. We talked for 40 minutes about roses and about whether dragonflies were actually friendly or just looked friendly, and about what she wanted to be when she grew up, which that week was either a marine biologist or someone who names paint colors for a living. I told her both seemed like excellent options. On the 7th morning, I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when someone knocked at the front door. Soft, careful, not the knock of someone who was sure of their welcome. I opened it. Vonnie stood on my porch. She was wearing old clothes, no makeup, hair pulled back. She looked like she had not been sleeping. She said, "Mom, can I come in? I don't want to ask for anything. I just need to talk to you." I stepped back. She came in and sat on the edge of the couch and was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she said, "Craig and I have been talking. Really talking, not the way we usually talk, where we're both waiting for the other person to stop. And I've been thinking about everything you said and about what I let happen, and I don't have a good explanation for it. I just kept telling myself we were just borrowing time, that things would turn around and we'd pay you back and it would all even out. But it never turned around, and I stopped asking myself why I kept going back to you, because the answer was uncomfortable. I didn't say anything. She said the answer was that you always said yes, and I let that become a reason not to fix our own problems." She stopped. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and then went quiet. She said, "What Craig did with the attorney, I didn't know about that until after you told me. I want you to believe me." "I don't know if that matters," I said. "It matters." She looked up. I said, "It doesn't change what happened, but it matters." She nodded. She twisted her hands together the way she had since she was small when she was working up to something she wasn't sure how to say. She said, "I watched Lily on that video call with you, 40 minutes, talking about roses and dragonflies and paint colors. She didn't ask you for a single thing. She just wanted to talk to you. And I realized I can't remember the last time I called you just to talk. I could not think of the last time either." She said, "I don't want to be someone Lily has to apologize for someday." I thought about Lily at the birthday party, bringing me a hot dog with careful mustard, sitting next to me on the damp grass while her parents worked the crowd. Already compensating, already watching. 8 years old and already making up for what the adults around her forgot to do. I said, "Then don't be." It was not an absolution. I did not offer it as one, and she did not take it as one. But she sat with it, and after a while she asked quietly if she could stay for a little while, just to sit. I said yes. We sat in the living room without the television on. She looked at the photographs on the wall, the one from our vacation at Jekyll Island when she was 9, the one from my last year of teaching when my class had made me a card as tall as I was. After a while she got up and made us both tea without being asked, and brought it back and set mine on the side table where I could reach it. It was not everything, it was a beginning. Craig called 2 days later. He did not apologize in any way that sounded like it came from understanding rather than necessity, and I did not pretend that it did. I told him that what happened between him and Vonnie was their business to sort out, and that what happened between him and my finances was closed, and that I wished him well in making something better of things. He said okay in a way that meant he had not expected that. I said goodbye and hung up. The financial changes held. The will stood as written. The house remained in my name with a trust arrangement that James Whitmore had drawn up to make certain it would go to Lily when the time came, directly, clearly, with no opportunity for anyone to position themselves between my intentions and my granddaughter. I did not hear from Craig again for a long time. That was fine. What I had instead was mornings that belonged to me. I walked the neighborhood before the heat came up and nodded at the people I had been too distracted to notice for years. I called a friend from my teaching days who lived in Augusta, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, and it was one of the best conversations I'd had in longer than I wanted to admit. I started keeping a small journal, nothing dramatic, just a place to put the days so I could remember them. Lily called every few days. She was reading a book about oceans. She had decided dragonflies were definitely friendly. Vonnie called on a Tuesday evening, not for anything, just to say she had made Leroy's sweet potato pie recipe for the first time and it had turned out almost right, but the crust needed work. I gave her the tip about the butter temperature. She said, "I didn't know you knew that." I said, "There's a lot I know that nobody thought to ask about." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I know, I'm sorry for that. It was a small thing. But in 63 years I have learned that the small things are rarely small. They are the beginning of something if you let them be." I went to bed that night in a house that was entirely mine. No transfers pending, no requests outstanding, no low-grade hum of obligation running underneath everything like a current I had learned not to notice. I lay in the dark and took inventory of myself, which is a habit I had kept from the years of teaching, when you learn to know exactly where your energy was and where it had gone. I was 63 years old. I lived in a house with a garden Leroy had planted, and a desk he had built, and a quilt my mother had made, and a granddaughter who painted roses in the wrong color and got them almost right. I had money that was mine and a will that said what I intended it to say, and mornings I did not have to arrange around anyone else's emergencies. I had a daughter who was slowly and imperfectly beginning to understand the difference between leaning on someone and taking from them. I believed that. I chose to believe it, not out of blindness, but out of the honest, clear-eyed hope of a woman who has known enough people to understand that some of them, when they finally see what they have become, decide to change. The magnolia outside my bedroom window was starting to bud. It happened every March, whether I was paying attention or not. This year I was paying attention. The morning comes early now and I don't fight it. I make coffee and carry it to the front porch and let the neighborhood wake up around me at its own pace. The light in Savannah in the early morning has a quality I have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't seen it. Something to do with the moss and the water and the angle of the sun, a softness that isn't weakness. I sat on my porch on one of those mornings not long ago, and I thought about all the years I had organized myself around what other people needed from me, how I had confused being needed with being loved, how I had kept writing checks because it felt like care, when sometimes it was just the easier thing, easier than the conversation, easier than a boundary, easier than watching someone I loved have to figure things out on their own. I understood now that helping someone indefinitely is not always love. Sometimes it is a way of never having to find out what they are capable of. Vonnie is figuring it out. Craig is, more slowly, beginning to understand that the structure they had built required someone else's foundation, and that a structure like that does not hold. They are making adjustments I was not consulted about and do not need to be, because that is how it should have been from the beginning. Lily is still calling. Last week she finished the book about oceans and started one about birds. She asked me if I thought she could come stay with me this summer for a week, just us, and we could look at the birds in the marsh. I said absolutely. I said bring your watercolors. She sent me a small drawing that afternoon, 2 birds standing in shallow water, rendered in the careful, imprecise way of a child who is learning to see and learning to render what she sees at the same time. She had gotten the light on the water almost right. I put it on the refrigerator. There is a version of my life that almost went a very different direction. A version where I didn't open that envelope, or I opened it and told myself it was probably nothing, or I let my love for my daughter talk me out of what I clearly understood. I have thought about that version and about how small the difference is between the life you drift into and the life you decide to live. The decision is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is quiet, and it is early in the morning, and it is you and your coffee and the particular light of a place that belongs to you. Understanding finally, after longer than you should have needed, that belonging to yourself is not a hardship. It is everything. It is the whole point.